Thank you, Lauren, for doing the grounding technique. I think it's really sort of is relevant to what we'll be talking about today. So, yeah, if you haven't already, please type in the chat your name, your role, your organization, your county, and what brought you here this morning. We don't have any disclosures for this. CalMAP is supported by federal and state grant funding. This is the learning objectives for the presentation today, that hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll be able to define trauma stewardship in 2 core principles, identify 2 or 3 signs of trauma exposure response, and identify 2 or 3 strategies to build capacity for what we're calling today trauma stewardship. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page about the what trauma is. DSM defines trauma as really something that's a threat to one's physical integrity, but because we're such complex humans, it's, I think, helpful to think of it as something that's disturbing, that results in, significant fear and other disruptive feelings that can have long-lasting negative effects on a person's overall attitude, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. There's different types of trauma as well, acute traumas, such as the fires in, the fires in LA, chronic traumas resulting from repeated and prolonged exposure to traumatic events, and complex trauma resulting from exposure to multiple traumatic events, often a bit more an invasive interpersonal nature. I think a lot of what people are experiencing today, the type of trauma that people are working with and that we're encountering, include all 3 types of trauma. But that also, important to recognize with complex trauma that there's societal factors, really with all 3 types of trauma, societal factors that are impacting how people are experiencing them. Really what's important to know about trauma is how it affects the nervous system. And so usually this is sort of an example of what a healthy nervous system looks like, where you stay within a normal range of the activation of the nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is a network of nerves that control our fight or flight response, and it's really part of our overall automatic nervous system. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest, which helps maintain a state of calm and relaxation, promoting things like digestion, slowing the heart rate, regulating other essential functions. And so this is an example of really having a healthy balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Under threat, what happens is the hypothalamus in the brain triggers neurotransmitters, like also adrenaline, to release in the bloodstream, which signals your heart to beat faster, your lungs to open up, to get more oxygen, your sight, hearing, other senses become sharper, glucose gets released, along with stored fat for extra energy. And, when you're under an acute threat, like there's, often the example used of a tiger, that, we need our system to activate like this. But all of these changes happen so quickly that people often even aren't aware of them. And the wiring is so efficient in our system to do this, that the amygdala and hypothalamus start this cascade even before the brain's visual centers have a chance to fully process what's happening. So this is where the parasympathetic nervous system kind of tries to then restore balance when the threat is gone. But often what happens is that these symptoms can become stuck in our sympathetic nervous system, can become stuck in a fight or flight response. So even when the threat is gone, there's the sense of perceived threat and often cues or memories or thoughts that trigger the sympathetic nervous system to become on, which is where you see the hypervigilance, irritability, insomnia, and other symptoms. And then also where the parasympathetic nervous system is being overly kind of in overdrive, where people are exhausted, frozen, stuck, numb. So this is where kind of you see where you have too much or one of the other, or there's an oscillation between the both of them. So Lauren's activity at the beginning is a good example of how breathing is key to activating the parasympathetic nervous system, and that this is a way to support one's trauma recovery. So often in trauma-informed treatment, breathing techniques and other sort of ways of regulating the nervous system are really important. So what we're going to talk about today is something called trauma stewardship, which these are the sources, the book Trauma Stewardship, written by Laura Vanderlipsky in 2005, Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. So Laura is someone who started doing work when she was 18, volunteering in shelters, working in domestic violence, working with survivors of acute traumas of all kinds. And she also became an activist for community organizing and movements for social and environmental justice. And she coined this term trauma stewardship. And it's really Laura describes a decade into her career when she came to realize, with the results of witnessing and being intimately involved in trauma for so many years while lacking insight in how to sustain herself amidst such conditions. And so as part of her attempt to come back from the brink, she began a journey of inquiry into the lasting effects of how individuals and communities are impacted by trauma exposure. So trauma stewardship is really this idea of the practice through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experience of others, which is work that I think that all of you are doing and your organizations are doing, or your, environments that you work in are trying to do. And so what happens when we're exposed to trauma for a period of time, what happens is the trauma exposure, what we're being exposed to, becomes an internal reality for us. And it takes place as a result of this exposure to the suffering of other people. So this is also known by other names, such as vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout. And so today really is a kind of a giving information about trauma exposure and its impact, and looking at it with curiosity. I think, it's personal in a lot of ways, and it's also cultural in terms of the organizations that we work in. And so approaching it with curiosity is something that Laura really encourages. If I'm exposed to suffering over this arc of time, is there a possibility that I'm being affected by this exposure? And how might I be being affected? And maintaining this compassion for ourselves and the others that we work with while we explore our trauma exposure response. So there's really various influences on our trauma exposure response. So of course, our personal experience, who we are as individuals, our own history of hardship and pain and trauma, what resources were available to us, what led us to do the work that we do, and how does our personal history overlap with the work that we are doing. So these are all sort of our personal experiences that impact how we respond to doing trauma stewardship work. Then, of course, the organization. What is the culture of the organization that we work in? Does it mitigate or exacerbate the effects of trauma exposure? You know, research shows when people perceive their organization to be supportive, they experience lower levels of trauma exposure response or vicarious trauma. But the reality is people are being asked to perform demanding jobs without a lot of support. And as a result, people aren't able to necessarily do the job as well as they would like. So for examples of this is like in school, you know, staff need to attend to the emotional needs of students at the same time as prepare them for these rigorous state exams. Or in the healthcare system, doctors have to, it's hard to attend to the psychological needs of their patients because of the time limits for their visits, for seeing each patient. So this is sort of all organizational factors that can impact one's trauma exposure response. So some questions that Laura invites us to ask is like, what is the energy level in our organization? What's the vibe? And that these qualities don't have to do with actually the intensity of the work, which sometimes is the perception, but with the structures, policies, and attitudes that support or impede the staff efforts to fulfill their mission. And then lastly, there's societal factors. Society at large interfaces with our trauma exposure response. Laura talks a lot about oppression, which is defined as, the negative outcome experienced by people kept down by the unjust use of authority, force, or societal norms. And then when a society institutionalizes this repression, that this is a systemic, known as systemic oppression. So, she points out, like, if we lived in a society without oppression, where there was equity and respect and access and justice, then the impact of trauma exposure on our lives would be very different. So suffering would still happen, but the difference would be we would only have to confront suffering at face value, like an illness or a hurtful act, and we would not have to wonder if the disparities between rich and poor, white people and people of color, heterosexual and gay, lesbian, transgender people, these disparities, so on, are contributing to the suffering. And we would not have to wonder if we personally benefit from the disparities, and we would not have to decide where we should act to change the disparities, or we would have situations where people are blamed for the suffering because of the disparity, or we would not have to ignore, as some people do, the disparities. So all of these are sort of societal factors that impact our trauma exposure response. So if we are to work with people and communities who are suffering or experience trauma in a sustainable way, we must understand how the work affects us and take an honest assessment of our own feelings and behaviors and changes in response to what trauma we've been exposed to. So it's very common to feel overwhelmed or defensive when we're recognizing that things are kind of not the way that we'd like them to be in our lives, or we're having these responses. But Laura really, encourages and identifies that these are pattern responses. So we see certain patterns and how people respond to doing trauma work or trauma stewardship work over a period of time. And so she sort of identifies 16 common consequences of trauma exposure. And it's not always easy to see that these are results of trauma exposure. But as I said, like, these are certain patterns that emerge. So I'm going to play a video this is a TED Talk that she gave, where she describes some of these common responses that we'll see, that we see. So give me a second to get to the point in the video. Hopefully it won't interrupt us with the commercial.
who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit where we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to other suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff? And would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation. Because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately, it was my stepfather-in-law who said, "Are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you?" And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview. There's so many ways that we can be affected individually and collectively by exposure to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. Many people call it many different things, but this exposure affects all of us so differently. What I have found through the privilege of getting to work with everyone from zookeepers to judges, school teachers to nurses, ecologists to activists, is that it is breathtaking, the commonalities of how one is affected, right? So some of the ways we find where you feel like you're not doing enough, right? So here they're saying we just haven't been flapping them hard enough. So this is where you feel like you're not doing enough. You constantly feel like you should be doing more, right? Another one could be morale. So they're saying, I see you've done time, so working in a cubicle shouldn't be a problem. So I work with organizations nationally, internationally, and one of the things we find so much is the morale, the very, very quickly eroding morale. Okay. Here he's saying, I bark at everything. You can't go wrong that way. So hypervigilance, many people can relate to a sense of hypervigilance. This is where you lose your ability to flow in, really fluidly in between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. You become in kind of in hyper arousal. I had a colleague say to me, she was a child support enforcement officer, and she said to me, I can tell you which ones of my son's friends are going to grow up to not pay their child support. And her son was 5 years old, right? Here he's saying, no, not there, please. That's where I'm going to put my head. So exhaustion is something many people can relate to, and not the exhaustion before you work out, but this is an exhaustion where you are tired in your soul, you are tired in your spirit, you are tired throughout your bone marrow. All of your ancestors were tired people, right? There's the avoidance. He's saying, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? This is where the best part of your day at work is where you don't have to do your job, right? And then there's the avoidance in our personal lives. She's saying, it's too late, Roger. They've seen us. Cynicism, many of you can relate to. They're saying, but she'll come down eventually, and she'll come down hard. So what many of you might be able to relate to is not the pure cynicism, but the cynical humor, right? And then anger and rage. He's saying it's a new antidepressant. Instead of swallowing it, you throw it at anyone who appears to be having a good time. And here he's saying, I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. So the other thing we see here is the externalizing that happens when more and more people are asked to do more with fewer resources. We see this whole seduction to externalizing. So this is where you start saying to yourself, you know, I would actually be fine taking care of my loved ones if I could have different loved ones to take care of. Or people say, I would love coming to my job every day if my immediate supervisor would just retire, right? And then there's blind spots that we have. So one of the things that we notice a lot that people have is blind spots. I'll share the story to illustrate it. This is a water bottle. It says the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It's one of approximately, over 100 water bottles I have in my home that have been gifted to me, like incredible programs that many of you are involved with, right? And every water bottle I have in my home has something stenciled on the side like this, which has, domestic violence, sexual assault, HIV/AIDS, infant mortality, flood, hurricane, tornado, tsunami, death, destruction, right? And I'm just thinking, this is great. I got water bottles. Every day is Earth Day here. This is fantastic. But what it also means is these are the water bottles that go with my kids to swim meets, basketball tournaments, soccer games, right? And I'm not thinking anything of it. But then I was unpacking my child's lunch some time ago, and I noticed that at school, she found the provisions to kind of hack over the word sexual, right? So she's not exactly old enough to know what sexual violence is. She's definitely old enough to know you're not sitting at the lunch table at school with a water bottle that says domestic and sexual violence on it, right? I don't know why, but I decided to tell this story at a very large conference of police officers. And when the break came, a police officer came up to me 2 centimeters from my face, 20 bucks in her hand, and said, go get your kid a proper water bottle. So I feel like things have gone very wrong in life when you've got the cops giving you cash, instructing you on parenting, right? And then dogma and self-righteousness. Okay, so here he's saying your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country and your mother doesn't. And then addictions, which many of us can relate to. She's saying, of course I drink during the day. I'm way too tired to drink at night. And numbing. So here he's saying, could we have the dosage? I still have feelings. One of the things I want.
Okay. So yeah, if you've read Trauma Stewardship or you plan to read Trauma Stewardship, that's one of the things to back to the beginning. One of the things to know about Laura, she uses a lot of humor and she uses these cartoons to demonstrate sort of the ways that we see these patterns of how trauma exposure affects us. So you are probably, a lot of you are familiar with Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps a Score. And in another book he wrote called Psychological Trauma, he identifies these traits that are shared among people who are able to integrate a primary trauma into their lives and adapt. And, these include a sense of personal control. So this perceived connection between their own actions and how they feel, and the belief in one's ability to influence the course of their lives. The pursuit of personal meaningful tasks, so being engaged in their life, which helps them to be active in challenging times, healthy lifestyles, and social support. So the challenge that we face is how can we be well enough for ourselves to reconcile all that we are witnessing? And so when Laura was explaining about these 16 common consequences of trauma exposure, it's really just an invitation to ask, if I identify with warning signs, I'm still okay, and perfectly normal to have these trauma response exposures it's perfectly normal to have these responses to trauma exposure. And so, how is this working for me? How is this working for those that I serve? How is my work sustainable? And what is a more functional way to respond, are sort of questions that we're invited to ask. And even if we don't believe that we have any trauma exposure responses, what compassion and insight can we bring to those who do, and the people, the other people that we work with who do. So sort of switching into now kind of how do we respond to our responses, right? And Laura created this image, which she calls the 5 directions. And it's an image that really provides a visual reminder as you orient to your day. Or it's kind of like a compass into how to navigate trauma stewardship work. The north being inquiry, the east being focused, the west balance, the south compassion, and then this what she calls 5th direction of centering oneself. So we'll go a little bit into these different directions or kind of spaces that she invites us to do in order to do this work. So the north direction, why am I doing what I'm doing? You know, finding your why. So she invites us before starting our workday to really stop and ask ourselves, or ask yourself this question, why am I doing what I'm doing? And after you hear your answer, really, you know, mindfully breathe in the responsibility and the choice of this acknowledgement. And she encourages to consult with people, use our supervision to talk about our why, or consult with people that we trust about the why of why we're doing what we're doing, or write it down and return to it when we find yourself going astray. And then this question, is trauma mastery a factor for me? So trauma mastery is really interesting because it addresses one way that people cope with trauma. And it's really a sophisticated way of coping with trauma and the lack of control over experiencing trauma. And really, it's with people would try and get a sense of control by turning the traumatic incident where we feel powerless into a new situation where we can feel confident and in charge. And so it's often unconscious. And the hope is really to become conscious of this if this is something that we're seeking to do. And people can do it in their activities, in their relationships, and then in our work. So really asking oneself, is part of what I'm doing here, you know, are there historical wounds that might be motivating me? And if trauma mastery is a reason that one is drawn to how they are doing the work, how else are you also attending to the original trauma in your area of life? And are there additional ways that you could support your healing, thereby decreasing your potential dependency on your work to sort of complete this effort? So and then this question, is this working for me? So kind of gaining insight into the why of our work and finding specific parts that do work for us can be really a tremendous gift as we do trauma stewardship. And then she invites us in the West to find balance, right? Engage with life outside of work, practice gratitude, restore our nervous system, move energy through these mindfulness practices that we might do, or mindful activities like Lauren started with the conscious breathing. But there's other ways too: writing, singing, dancing, walking, laughing, yoga, being in nature, meditation. These are all ways to engage with our lives and move energy through and practice gratitude. And so this is one example of 5 daily questions that you can ask yourself to practice finding balance. And Laura talks a lot about protecting your mornings and having morning rituals. So this is an example of something that's of a practice that you could do of inquiry into what am I grateful for? Who am I checking in on or connecting with today? What expectations of normal am I letting go of? How am I moving my body today? And what beauty am I creating, cultivating, or inviting today? So, and this is an example of a way to kind of have a daily practice of finding balance. And then one of the, we go back to the compass. One of the things that I think she also manages, she talks a lot about in finding balance is really taking care of our nervous system. So I'm going to just share a quick sort of tip that she gives, especially relevant today, about finding balance when there's a lot of news, a lot of exposure that can dysregulate our nervous system.
Hello and welcome to.
So these are all available on YouTube if you're curious to watch the whole thing. But this is sort of this piece around protecting our nervous systems.
Desperate measures, and in terms of practices of how you sustain. So in that spirit, I spent a lot of time talking about our nervous system. Obviously, like our nervous system podcast, a lot of people aren't seeing this, but our nervous system, and then acknowledging like where you live has a nervous system, where your loved ones spend time has a nervous system, your workplace has a nervous system, where you volunteer has a nervous system, your community has a nervous
Love
system,
that.
your region,
Yeah.
so there's your nervous system, and then there's all these nervous systems that are interwoven, right? And to be able to just continue to keep on keeping on, we need to make sure, and some of this work draws on Peter Levine's work, who wrote Waking the Tiger, we have to understand how to make sure our nervous system and all these related nervous systems don't get to a place of saturation, right? When we don't have conditions in place to metabolize, it's largely what I think about with trauma is like, how do you have conditions in place to metabolize what you're experiencing, what you're bearing witness to? When we don't have those conditions in place, then it doesn't take long, because of how this all works with our mind and body, until we get to a place of saturation. And saturation is largely what you were talking about earlier, that circle those manifestations come from. And as hard as that is, and as much as that sucks, humans don't stay saturated. What happens is we'll rupture. So sometimes there's an internal rupture if you're somebody who internalizes everything. Sometimes there's external rupturing, right? And usually it's a combination. So I think most people can relate to that experience of feeling saturated and then the rupturing that happens individually, but also many people's homes have been rupturing, during the pandemic, right? Many people's communities, certainly our society is absolutely rupturing. Okay, so then going back to what you're talking about in terms of very concrete practices, one of the easiest things that people can do for themselves is look around their day, take a micro moment, look around their life every day, and just decide today, what is any way today that I can refrain from unnecessary exposure, right? Because there's all these things. I mean, unless a listener is living on a monastery and has like a very different life than we're talking about, there's a huge amount of exposure, whether or not it's your work or not. So one of the most self-respecting things you can do, and again, this doesn't take any time, any resource, take a microsecond, you look around your day and you think, today, where can I refrain from exposing myself that would otherwise unnecessarily jack up my nervous system? Okay, so going back to your friend, four of the most concrete things are, if you're on social media, get off of social media. If you're still going to be on social media, be mindful of your platforms, duration, time of day, how you engage. Same thing with news. If you're following the news, obviously, I mean, none of your listeners know me, but if you spend 1 second with me, I'm not somebody who's going to tell you to not engage with like social justice, environmental justice, but the degree to which you are involved with social and environmental justice has nothing to do with the time spent on platforms and the time spent consuming the news, right? So if you need to continue to know what's going on in there from a news standpoint, then we've got to figure out how you're going to do that in a way that is also sustainable, right? You're going to do that in a way where you're really intentional about your sources, again, time of day, how much vitriol comes with the news, all of that. So then, with what your friend is sharing, a lot of people I work with will grapple with this idea that if I'm not continuously, constantly, just obsessively on these platforms, social media, or I have the TV on in the kitchen all the time, or I have every news alert coming up, somehow, I'm a traitor. Somehow I'm selling out, right? Somehow I'm not bringing what I need to bear. And again, if we just take it back to neuroscience, you cannot sustain your nervous system in the way you're going to need without having significant health consequences if you are, number one, exposing yourself to such a degree that you can't recalibrate, and number two, becoming saturated. And so I think that sometimes just helping folks, particularly when they come from that place of like, somehow I'm selling out and I should still be able to be on social media and see the news, helping them understand that there is no shortage of ways you can contribute to the repair of this world. And it is not tied to your presence on those platforms and with the news. And there can be small, you don't have to go like run your cell phone over in the parking lot, but even small practices. I talk all the time in my work about protecting your morning, right? Like when you first wake up, don't reach for a portable electronic device. Give yourself a few minutes to come into a waking state before you get crushed by cortisol, right? Like that's a very, very small practice, but there's these other practices about like, okay, if I'm going to stay of this world, how am I going to do it strategically? And what you and your dad talk about all the time, intentionally, mindfully, deliberately.
An aspect of that, which is another one.
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to this, where am I putting my focus, and being intentional and choosing our focus. And I think it's gonna take me back to the beginning again. But this is another kind of visual that she developed around choosing our focus, about having less distraction and more intention in our life. So she talked about protecting your morning as an example of that. And then disconnecting less and being present more. So this is really kind of core to Laura's approach to trauma stewardship, that being present, being awake, being aware in the moment, and being able to bring that presence to others is really the big theme of responding to trauma exposure, and that there are innumerable ways to become present. And it's not easy though, right? There are many internal and external challenges that she was just speaking to that make it very difficult to practice presence. And so that's where these practices, engaging your breath, being active, being in nature, these different, having daily practices, like some of the ones that we talked about, are really helpful to doing the work and making it a practice. And sometimes, some days it's hard, and some days it's more simple. So this is an example, and this kind of goes back to the south orientation on the compass of practicing compassion or loving kindness meditation. If we have time, we could do this together, but I'll also see if maybe want to leave a little time for discussion. But this is a practice of a meditation, a compassion meditation, that also supports regulating the nervous system, practicing presence. And so maybe I'll conclude with reading the conclusion to trauma stewardship, and then invite people's questions and feedback and experiences. Really would love to hear more about what you want to put in your trauma stewardship toolkit. So we talked about the 5 directions and some of the different practices and ways of responding to trauma exposure. So she says, as we continue on our journeys, may our lives be informed by our deepening awareness of our role in life's web. May we care well for ourselves and for others, May we remember that our courage on this path lies in the way that we take each and every step. If one is to do good, it must be done in the minute particulars, says the English poet and artist William Blake. May we remember that trauma stewardship requires us to honor others and our planet in a way that is possible only if we have made a commitment to our own path of wellness. May we discover peace amid strife, joy, amid the suffering, and trust amid the groundlessness that is ultimately life's course. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop sharing. I wasn't able to see if there was any comments in the chat. Doesn't look like there are, but I welcome people's, we can do the mindfulness, the loving kindness meditation, but also just wanted to invite to see if there were any reactions, thoughts.
Thank you so much, Marielle. And we could stop the recording at this point. And again, anyone who's able to turn your cameras on, we'd love to see you and help build this community.